All right, everybody. Here we are. I wasn't sure how I would feel before I started this second stream here. And I gotta say, I kind of felt like maybe I would feel a little more comfortable. Um, Really, I mean, this is a tough book. And I think that a few of the things that we're learning here it involve it being a tough goal that we've chosen for ourselves in doing this particular book first. That's the case in part because I haven't really spent just a ton of time with it, and I only discovered it a few months ago, so I haven't really had just the deepest level of engagement with Beauvoir or this text in particular. And so I think that makes it a little bit tougher to sort of keep the wheels on here. But I guess that's okay. I don't necessarily have a problem with people seeing the process as it sort of unfolds. And I think it's probably good to sort of build in this experience that I've had over the past couple of days of sitting down with this text and really looking at it more closely than I have in the past, right? So there's a development going on, and I believe that the objective with something like a Twitch stream is to make the process itself a bit more accessible. So instead of just releasing this polished and finely tuned product, which I probably still will do somewhere on Medium, maybe Serious Philosophy, maybe the Apeiron blog, or maybe something else. The idea is just more or less that what we want to do is expose people to the art of reading philosophy well. I took a class in undergraduate school where all we did, it was only I think 10 weeks long or maybe 8 weeks long. It was 2 credit hours instead of 3, I remember. And all we did was we read books and we wrote what we called an exegesis about each book that we had read. And the expectation in that class was that you would come to class having read the material and understanding the material in enough depth to have a decent conversation about it. And really I learned a lot in that particular class. But also in the other classes that followed, because of course having sort of more depth in terms of the core skill set, right, of just being able to sit down and really get deep into one of these texts, it helped develop my process, and then everything I've done since has benefited from that development that has already at this point taken place. So with all of that in mind, we're going to go ahead and move into section 2, personal freedom and others. This is part of De Beauvoir's seminal text, Ethics of Ambiguity. And essentially, this is the section where we're going to start to see the serious man. And we're going to see what the problems are with seriousness at sort of a philosophical level. I believe I decided to call serious philosophy before I had read this text, before I understood De Beauvoir's notion that seriousness is this sort of problem that we want to push back on. I believe I actually found a passage in Nietzsche which discusses philosophy as though people are joking in some sense, as if it's not to be taken seriously, so to speak. And so the idea was that what we wanted to do was something a little bit different with serious philosophy than what other people were doing with their philosophy pages. We wanted to make it a little bit more intense, so to speak, and sort of open it up to allow philosophical, political essays, those sorts of things to grace the pages at some point, just to keep things interesting. And now it's a little ironic because one of the first essays that I actually wrote for that publication that I started, that was called and still is called Serious Philosophy, what was an essay called "Seriousness is a Problem." so it's been a lot of fun, and I'm really enjoying that. So please feel free to check us out over on Medium. It's Serious Philosophy. You can write for us if you like. Definitely looking for writers. But let's go ahead and get into the De Beauvoir stuff, because there is a lot in this section. In particular, I'd say about the first half of the text here seems just deeply loaded with meaning that's just waiting to be unpacked. Especially where we are today, in the present political situation, where we've got this leader who, President Trump, he really wants to be taken seriously, and yet at the same time he wants to commit these sins of sort of omission with regard to like testing for the coronavirus, and so there's just sort of this fundamental dishonesty that's going on with that. And the American electorate right now is, or at the very least, the American electorate seems to be reacting very strongly to this. I don't know. I want to say it's a disconnected approach to government, because what you have on the one hand is this grim and terrifying reality. You have these well-accepted scientific standards for what should be done and how action should take place at the highest levels of government. And then you have what actually has gone on and what the government has actually done, which is basically just to lose a bunch of the coronavirus tests because Jared Kushner forgot to request a refrigerated shipping container for them. I mean, and so, yeah, people are really upset about the administration not having taken the coronavirus seriously enough. The results that they have gotten with the efforts that they've done have been utterly underwhelming. And so there's sort of this failure that the American people are currently, I guess, we'll see what the election results end up being, but I wouldn't be surprised at all to see this written down in history as sort of a referendum on the way that Trump wanted to take himself seriously and the rest of the world not so much. And so this will be very interesting to delve into this seriousness discussion. But first, let's just have a look at the board here. I've got a couple of questions, one of which sort of surfaced last night, which is, what is evil? What is evil for existentialism? Who knows? That ought to be extremely interesting. I think Beauvoir writes off evil up until the existentialist moment by basically saying that people are just kind of incompetent, rather than people really having a bad will. It's that they're badly going about creating and then, executing that will, which sounds fairly right. So it'll be very interesting to see what she does in terms of defining evil. We've got that written on the board here. What is evil? Then we've got childishness qua morality, childishness qua minority, which is a Kantian notion that's going to come back up here. And it really seems like a very central thing to De Beauvoir. So probably the first video I do after this little series on Ethics of Ambiguity will involve, let me pull it out here, this book, and one particular essay that's in this book, which is called, wait for it, What is Enlightenment? So essentially the idea is that the values of the Enlightenment are sort of being produced there, and there's this extreme emphasis that's placed on rational thought and reason in terms of ways in which humans can become enlightened and do better in the world and so on. Now I've got non-idealistic, being a child is bad for you, written on the board here. And that's an important point to note as well as we get ready to kind of get started, because Beauvoir is not someone that you are going to think of as being particularly optimistic, but she's not particularly pessimistic either. What she wants to do is look at the world as it is and judge it for being whatever that happens to be. She's not so much intent upon coming out with a certain result. She doesn't want to prove that all people are good or that all people are evil or that you should think this about that. Any of that is what we would think of as idealism. And I believe that Beauvoir, is actually very opposed to the concept of ideals. And that makes a lot of sense because ideals aren't... They're not real. They're not things that you can go out there and find examples of in the world. So when you think of communism or socialism, and then on the one hand, and then pure capitalism, whatever that would be on the other hand, and you go out in the wild and you try to look for these things to see how they work, and there really aren't any examples. You can't find them. There's no there. So in reality, pretty much all the economies in the world are what we call a mixed system, where some things are more or less socialized and some things are more or less, regulated by the open market. And so the whole discussion, which is better, do we want capitalism, do we want socialism, yada, yada, yada. I mean, really and truly, at the end of the day, there just isn't a lot of value that can come out of that conversation, so to speak. Because to create value, what we would have to do is we would have to have a conversation that was actually about something real instead of just this sort of hypothetical or theoretical debate about what should be better in a perfect, whatever it's supposed to be about. So we've got this question over here too, and I've written it in green because I think it probably ought to stay up there through the end of section 3. This is sort of a continuation of the project that we looked at yesterday. Although I can't really remember what that was. It seems like I should remember that better. But so the question that we're looking at here is are we creating a system of moral values? Are we trying to create an oracle or a source of better information that we can then refer back to when we need to make a moral decision? Or is this more of just a reductive mechanistic account of behavior? Or a reductive mechanistic account of behavior is something like what neuroscience does, where we look at the mechanisms behind action and we attempt to reduce those down to the level of being a principle. And at that point, we can say that we have a principle that governs human behavior, and that allows us to basically postulate that action will take place in a certain way, and then we can test that against the actual behavior of people. So cognitive science is all about that type of thing. It would not be all that strange to find some of that here. But okay, let's go ahead and switch back to the main view here. And we are going to go ahead and get started with section 2, personal freedom and others. So we start with man's unhappiness. She says, man's unhappiness, says Descartes, is due to his having first been a child. And indeed, the unfortunate choices which most men make can only be explained by the fact that they have taken place on the basis of childhood. The child's situation is characterized by finding himself cast into a universe. This is very Heideggerian, by the way. Cast into a universe which he has not helped to establish. So this is a concept that's known as the thrownness of Dasein. And essentially, there was a philosopher who, I guess, actually was a Nazi. And he kind of had this whole anti-technology bent. He wrote a lot about language. And one of the things that he wrote that was the most influential was this concept of Dasein, which for him signifies the being that human beings have in particular. And so there were certain characteristics of Dasein. Nobody chooses to exist, for example. So you've got this thrownness. Then there's being unto death, and death is sort of the only thing that you know for certain is going to happen to you. So we act differently towards that than we do other things that I suppose are a bit more uncertain for Heidegger. But for now, all we really need to know is just that De Beauvoir is a big Heidegger fan, and she found a lot of useful concepts there. But that doesn't necessarily constitute sort of this endorsement of the Heideggerian worldview. In particular, there's an authoritarian bent to it because Heidegger believed that it was very important to sort of engage with your culture, even if what your culture was up to was something like Nazism, which I believe De Beauvoir would say that the way to make oneself the most free in that situation would be to oppose Nazism, because that was the source of sort of all these rules and all these conflicts that came for the people who did believe that way, and I believe that there's sort of this tension that's really going to play out in this section between sort of that conservative Heideggerian sort of right-wing reading of what it is to be a person in a culture. Because I believe De Beauvoir wants to be far more radical, and she wants to say that we're always going to end up being responsible for what we end up getting up to. So, in his eyes, human inventions, words, customs, and values are given facts as inevitable as the sky and the trees. This means the world in which he lives is a serious world. Note the word choice there, serious. This is going to be a huge motif in this section here. This means that the world in which he lives is a serious world, since the characteristic of the spirit of seriousness is to consider values as ready-made things. That does not mean that the child himself is serious. On the contrary, he is allowed to play, to expend his existence freely. In his child's circle, he feels that he can passionately pursue and joyfully attain goals which he has set up for himself. But if he fulfills this experience in all tranquility, it is precisely because the domain open to his subjectivity seems insignificant and puerile in his own eyes. He feels himself happily irresponsible. The real world is that of adults, where he is allowed only to respect and obey. And so what we see is there's a sense in which the agency of the child is removed from him against his own wishes, perhaps. He's cared for by his parents, and really, at the end of the day, the decisions that he's allowed to make happen in sort of this, it's almost like a padded room. There's a protected environment, and childishness manifests itself within this sort of womb, if you will, right? So there's nothing necessarily at stake, which is where the carefree attitude and the rambunctious imagination get to kind of enter in. So she says this game of being serious can take on such an importance, in the child's life that he actually himself becomes serious. We know such children who are caricatures of adults. And so that sort of precocious adulthood is something it's not really moralized here. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's just sort of a strange thing that happens, because adults typically are the ones that are serious and children typically are not serious. But sometimes you have a child that becomes serious. And then what do? Well, you just kind of do whatever, right? Because the child isn't necessarily losing anything by claiming the ability to be serious. Although it's probably not as much fun for children who go that route. So she says here, normally the child escapes the anguish of freedom. And what she's talking about here is, she says, it is by virtue of this that the child's condition is metaphysically privileged. So by virtue of what? By virtue of this protection against the risk of existence. So children aren't expected to be able to care for themselves. They're not expected to pay their rent. The responsibility side of life is something that is withheld from children. Even serious children, I would say, for the most part, are at least to a lesser degree exposed to this sort of what she calls anguish of freedom, which is the responsibility to do what's possible to make life better for oneself and provide for oneself, despite having the full gamut of options in the world to choose from. So just a quick example, if I wanted to go to Vegas this weekend, I could take all my savings, I could, go in there and just throw that money on the blackjack table and just have at it. And that would be it. I would get rid of all my money, and that would be the end of the money. And so there's a sort of, there's a seriousness that I have to use whenever I manage my money, because I have to say no to things that don't get me what I need from that. That's sort of the anguish of freedom. There's a wide variety of options that are possible, but you have to sort of choose the one that's going to be the best for you in a handful of different respects. One of those is being able to eat, so you don't want to necessarily waste all of your potential future food on just having some fun, right? Although, if you have enough money where it's possible to go, waste it gambling and enjoy yourself that way, then that's fine. That's an option. She's not going to moralize against that, right? She's just going to say that, this is the type of decision that we make as adults generally, and you're not allowed in the casino as a child, and that allows the child to sort of escape from these sorts of consequences, like not being able to eat because you played games all last weekend and don't have any more money left. So she says here, there are beings whose life slips by in an infantile world because, having been kept in a state of servitude and ignorance, they have no means of breaking the ceiling which is stretched over their heads. Like the child, they can exercise their freedom, but only within this universe which has been set up before them, without them. This is the case, for example, of slaves who have not raised themselves to the consciousness of their slavery. And I mean, wow, what a stirring place to end up here in 2020 with all of the remarkable things that have happened. I think that what she's going for here is the concept that we found in Kant. Again, I mean, it's thick with minority and with autonomy, and essentially what she's saying is that the child is protected from the external world for his own good. Someone like a woman or like a slave, or like, let's just go ahead and go all the way here and say a man even that chose to follow someone else instead of blazing his own trail, so to speak. These are all going to be people who are not engaging with the world as rational moral agents, right? So what can we do? Well, we become conscious of the way that this has been imposed upon us, and then that in and of itself is an action which is radical enough to sort of get us back to the place where we are free. So to the extent that they respected the world of the whites, the situation of the black slaves was exactly an infantile situation. This is, and the reason she's saying this is because there's sort of, you're bowling, but you've got those inflatable things in the gutters, right? So you're not going to strike out. You're going to hit a pin if the ball makes it to the end of the alley, and so that's sort of the that's the world in which slaves are sort of kept alive, despite not really being autonomous agents that are able to choose what to do and where to go and and so on and so forth. So the reason that slavery is such a bad thing, the reason that we had to get rid of it, the reason that we still haven't done enough to sort of get rid of the legacy of it, which still oppresses people, is that this oppression, it dehumanizes us. It turns us into less than we were before. It makes us inferior to what we would have been had we not been enslaved in that particular way. So she says, this is also the situation of women in many civilizations. They can only submit to the laws, the gods, the customs, and the truths created by the males. Even today in Western countries, among women who have not had in their work an apprenticeship of freedom, there are still many who take shelter in the shadow of men. They adopt without discussion in the opinions and values recognized by their husband or their lover, and that allows them to develop childish qualities which are forbidden to adults because they are based on a feeling of irresponsibility. So, on the one hand, there's the world. The world is complex, the world is difficult, and the world involves the chance of loss. And then on the other hand, you have people who can serve as a sort of shelter. And so what she's discussing here, the reason lovers in particular are brought into this, is that you can find someone else and you can follow that person. And you can basically be that person's dog. And that person will probably feed you and make sure you've got medicine and take care of you and stuff. But you will never get to make your own decisions about life. And in order to actually live, that is a central component of what needs to happen, right? It is only in our decisions that we are ever even conceived of as something like living beings. And that's another big thread for existentialism that comes up a little bit later on too. It is just this idea that you are your choices. That's what you are. You're not anything else. You're your choices, you're your body, and you're unique. But okay, so the absence of the serious is highlighted here because what we're talking about with respect to the absence of the serious is also the absence of autonomy. Seriousness is important to have to some extent because seriousness is the recognition that my actions have consequences. The reason I become serious in the first place is because I recognize that there's a relationship between the cause and effect. If I do something and something else happens, I can predict what is coming next. And so let's say that you come to me and you say, hey, let's rob a bank. If I'm being childish, I'll say, of course, why not? What could possibly go wrong? And maybe we go rob the bank and maybe we end up in jail. That seems pretty likely. And so if that happens, that is the fact that has occurred is not the fault of anyone except for myself, because I have chosen to take part in this scheme to rob this bank, and that results in me being prosecuted for committing that crime, right? So there's a one-to-one relationship, and part of success in the modern world as an adult is recognizing that there are these sort of cause and effect relationships and navigating the dangers that are represented thus. So what we're talking about is fundamentally ambiguous, and the reason that it's ambiguous is because we don't want to completely avoid seriousness. We don't completely want to live in childish flippancy and just kind of hang out and do whatever we want all the time, because if we do, we end up sort of bereft of our ability to make moral decisions, which is an important part of being a person. It's especially important in terms of the type of life that you want to live. So how do we walk that tightrope? And I think one of the most difficult things about this book is that Beauvoir herself is not going to come out and just say this, right? She's gonna talk around it. She's gonna explain why, but she's gonna leave it to the reader to actually put the pieces together and come to the conclusion that it's best for each of us to sort of be our own person and live our own life. All right, that was good coffee. Let's move along just a little bit here. I'm trying to do a better job of just taking my time than I did yesterday. I feel like maybe I got tripped up a little bit, especially with some of the longer little selections from the text that I wanted to, sort of pick on and focus on. And the reason for that was that I wasn't sure how much time I had. I wasn't sure exactly how everything was going to work. And I was a little bit nervous. So I think there were a couple of places where I would have preferred to explain things in a little bit more detail and focus perhaps, on the first part of the quotation as opposed to just sort of the last part. I noticed I sort of did that quite a bit. So we're going to try not to go there so much this time. But okay, let's go ahead and move right along here. It is then that we discover the difference which distinguishes them from an actual child. The child's situation is imposed upon him, whereas the woman, the Western woman of today, chooses it or at least consents to it. And that's important, right? Because there's a sort of force in society that wants to push people into making this type of choice. Safety, security, that type of a mindset, that type of a goal is something that forces, not just women into relationships with men, but men into relationships with employers and women into relationship with employers that just don't benefit them the way that a healthy relationship would, right? She says, ignorance and error are facts as inescapable as prison walls. The Negro slave of the 18th century, the Mohammedan woman enclosed in a harem, have no instrument, be it in thought or by astonishment or anger, which permits them to attack the civilization which oppresses them. Their behavior is defined and can be judged only within this given situation. And it is possible that in this situation, like every human situation, they realize a perfect assertion of their freedom. But once there appears a possibility of liberation, it is resignation of freedom not to exploit the possibility, a resignation which implies dishonesty and which is a positive fault. And so what we've discovered here, what Beauvoir is talking about here, is something that almost gets to the point of answering our question about evil. So if we're wondering what is evil, and we begin to understand that there is a sort of a real fault that happens with people when they choose just to follow others and not to exert themselves and become themselves in reality. Let's read on just a little bit further and see maybe, I believe there's a slightly deeper unpacking of this here in just a second. She says, this is phenomenal. She says, men stop appearing as if they were gods, and at the same time, the adolescent discovers the human character of the reality about him. Language, customs, ethics, and values have their source in these uncertain creatures. The moment and by uncertain creatures, she means human beings, adult human beings. The moment has come when he too is going to be called upon to participate in their operation. His acts weigh upon the earth as much as those of other men. He will have to choose and decide. It is comprehensible that it is hard for him to live this moment of his history, and this is doubtless the deepest reason for the crisis of adolescence. The individual must at last assume his subjectivity. And so, in the development of a healthy, good, effective, moral person, what De Beauvoir is saying is that there's this transition from childhood to adulthood called adolescence. And in adolescence, there is a crisis. And the essence of that crisis is that the individual must assume his subjectivity. So what is this assumption, right? I believe that's a fine way of breaking this down. It doesn't seem quite intuitive at first because we assume mantles, we assume things like that. But I believe that when we say that we are assuming subjectivity, yes, it's very much like putting on a mantle. But at the same time, what we're assuming is not subjectivity. What we're assuming is an assumption. We're adding an assumption to our worldview that incorporates our subjectivity. And so, what is the character of this assumption? So if we're looking at the non-idealistic component of existentialism that's at stake here, the only rule of this assumption of subjectivity that can apply to all people is that it must occur. We can't say anything particular about the character of your subjectivity or of my subjectivity. We can all be as weird as we want. We can make that subjectivity be whatever we want it to be. The trick is just that we have to assume this subjectivity. We have to bring it with us. It has to, in some sense, precede us. It gives us the context within which we can be comfortable, confident creators of our own lives. So it's very much like the responsibility that we take. You know, like I could obviously probably spend like a little bit more time at the gym or something like that, you know, and I don't, and I have to take responsibility for that. That's fine. It's my fault I don't have like a six-pack, you know. and that is what it is to be, you know, this guy. You know, if you're a different guy, then you can do whatever you want, and, you know, obviously we'll have different ideas of good pastimes, right? Like, well, hopefully this is something you're getting a kick out of, because I know I love reading through this stuff and kind of broadening my understanding of it a little bit. But let's dive right back in. I notice it's about 35 minutes into the video here, so let's just move along, and hopefully another hour should be plenty to get us where we need to be here. But she says, from one point of view, the collapsing of the serious world is a deliverance. Although he was irresponsible, the child also felt himself defenseless before obscure powers which directed the course of things. The parent's will is a good example of an obscure power which directs the course of things. They sit down and they strategize while you're asleep to make themselves better parents, and you sort of know that the conversation took place because their behavior changes as a result of it, at least ideally. And so there's, yes, to some extent, like all the different things that you don't understand, whether it's, you know, sex and drugs and violence in movies, or just things that you haven't been exposed to yet, like business. All of these things are going to be going on around you, right? And yet you're not responsible for them, and you're not really, generally you're not going to sit down and have those explained clearly to you. I think sometimes people do a great job of being parents, and maybe those conversations work themselves in when that happens. But in general, the character of childishness is that there are all kinds of things going on all around you that you do not understand, and that's okay because you're sort of being protected. But as you become an adult, it becomes very important to understand and to begin to make your own sort of decisions by coming up with what you think is going to happen as a result of a given action, taking the action, seeing what happens as a result, and sort of continually updating your behavior to make it better by doing this so that you get what you want more often. That's sort of, that's like learning how to swim in the pool, you know, like you become an adult, you get thrown into the pool, and you have to swim or sink, or the lifeguard comes and gets you, and I guess you get to be a kid forever. It's wild. I mean, there's so many different choices you can make in this world. She says, But whatever the joy of this liberation may be, it is not without great confusion that the adolescent finds himself cast into a world which is no longer ready-made, which has to be made. He is abandoned, unjustified, the prey of a freedom that is no longer chained up by anything. What will he do in the face of this new situation? Interesting. I think with respect to this question here, we may be about to get somewhere. She's wondering specifically, what is someone going to do in the face of the new situation? Well, he decides. This probably should have been highlighted too. So basically the goal for Beauvoir is to get people to make these decisions, right? She's not concerned about which direction you choose to go. She's concerned about whether you understand how important it is to make that first step happen. Let's see, we're talking about misfortune here. Therefore, the misfortune which comes to man as a result of the fact that he was a child is that his freedom was first concealed from him, and that all his life he will be nostalgic for the time when he did not know its exigencies. This misfortune has still another aspect. Moral choice is free and therefore unforeseeable. The child does not contain the man he will become, yet is always on the basis of what he has been that a man decides upon what he wants to be. He draws the motivations of his moral attitude from within the character with which he has given himself and from within the universe which is correlative. Now the child set up his character and this universe little by little without foreseeing its development. He was ignorant of the disturbing aspect of this freedom which he was heedlessly exercising. He tranquilly abandoned himself to whims, laughter, tears, and anger, which seemed to him to have no morrow and no danger, and yet which left ineffaceable imprints about him. The drama of original choice is that it goes on moment by moment for an entire lifetime, that it occurs without reason, before any reason, that freedom is there as if it were present only in the form of contingency. This contingency recalls, in a way, the arbitrariness of grace distributed by God in the Calvinistic doctrine. Here, too, there is a sort of predestination issuing not from an external tyranny, but from the operation of the subject itself. Only we think that man has always a possible recourse to himself. There is no choice so unfortunate that he cannot be saved. And so, at the end of the day, the misfortune is the thing that makes the adult. It's not possible to protect someone from misfortune and allow that person to still be a moral agent or an adult or a real person, so to speak, right? But that's okay, because there is no choice so unfortunate that you can't come back to being yourself and you can't get better from it, right? So salvation for De Beauvoir here, and I think this is a big part of sort of the real project here. I'll change back to the board so that we can have a little bit more, okay, here. Yeah, now we can see this a little better. But the important question that we had when we set out to do this in the first place is, what is the real project here? We know we're looking at an ambiguous sort of character for ethics, and we know that we aren't, as a result of that undertaking, likely to be presented with a list of rules and principles that are easy to understand and still easier to follow. What she is trying to do is create in us a sense in which we are sort of unchained. We're free to make the decisions that we want to make. And that's what's important for De Beauvoir. It isn't that she's going to lay out some set of rules and it's going to be perfect and we're never going to want to change them or anything like that. No, we're free to make all of those determinations for ourselves. And that's important because that's how we learn to begin making the right sorts of decisions to become the person that we want to become. And that's what enables us to be free. That's what enables us to create. So when we look at what the real project is, we can't say that it's necessarily a system. And the problem with calling it a system is that it doesn't really have that much content. The point of what De Beauvoir is doing here is that by reading this text, your mind changes a little bit. And you begin to realize just how important it is to be yourself, even if what that is wrong, because that sort of opens the door for you to kick on this feedback loop where you pay attention to the results that you get, and you think back and say, well, I did that, but maybe that wasn't quite right, so maybe next time I'll do it this way. And so you develop these principles that otherwise you wouldn't have been able to develop. But what's important is the development. So, are we making a system here? I think I'm going to go ahead and say no. So we'll just kind of put a line through that. I don't think that what we're getting out of this is really a system of ethics, in the sense that some of the other systems that we get are actually, in fact, systems. Like Jeremy Bentham's notion of utilitarianism is very much a system for codifying certain types of values so that a certain type of decision is easier to make, right? Here, we're saying, look, decisions are going to be hard to make. The way we choose to do that is going to make us the person that we end up becoming. And so it's important to pay attention, but it's equally important not to tell anybody exactly how to live their life. So for the same reason, I would say that it's not an oracle either. This isn't the Bible. You're not going to read this and become inspired as to what you should do, because really and truly, this is just telling you be yourself. It's saying be yourself, be yourself, be yourself all the way through, and it's proving that that's the right way to do things. And so, is this a reductive, mechanistic account of behavior? Well, I think that remains to be seen. I think if we are looking at examples in which this went well or examples in which this went poorly, maybe this is a reductive, mechanistic explanation. Okay, so let's get back to the text. We don't have too much more to do here. Let's see. Okay. Yes. So let's come down just a little bit more here. Yeah, here we go. So, having said that this isn't a system, she's going to give us a principle that we can observe, and I believe this is. I just drew a star by reductive mechanistic account. She says there is vitality only by the means of free generosity. Intelligence supposes goodwill, and inversely, a man is never stupid if he adapts his language and his behavior to his capacities. And sensitivity is nothing else but the presence which is attentive to the world and to itself. The reward for these spontaneous qualities issues from the fact that they make significances and goals appear in the world. They discover reasons for existing. Wow! I mean, that'll blow your mind, isn't it? So what she's doing right now is she is explaining how smart people do well for themselves. Oh man, isn't that crazy? There is vitality only by the means of free generosity. Intelligence supposes goodwill, and inversely, a man is never stupid if he adapts his language and his behavior to his capacities. So, look at what you're good at. Play to your strengths. I mean, this is basic stuff here, people. It's not too bad at all, is it? The reward for these spontaneous qualities issues from the fact that they make significances and goals appear in the world. They discover reasons for existing. So, what does this tell us about the nihilistic position? If if you become a nihilist, you're such a person that you are attempting to look for meaning in your life and you're unable to find it, right? So, according to sort of the schematic that we've sort of unearthed, like maybe a corner of here, sensitivity is going to be important, and then you're not finding enough significances in goals, right? So you're not paying enough attention to the world, and you're not adapting your language and behavior to your capabilities. So you're not responding enough to what's going on around you. And that could be that there's some kind of, damage that's happened in your past and you feel hurt because of that. And sometimes that pain looks from the outside like nihilism, right? A depressed person has a very difficult time interacting with the world because things that turn the rest of us on turn those people off, right? And I've been depressed before. You've probably been depressed before. The solution is kind of to muddle through until all of a sudden, boom, you're interacting again. You care again. It matters again. And so she says they confirm us in the pride and joy of our destiny as men. To the extent that they subsist in an individual, they still arouse sympathy, even if he has made himself hateful by the meaning which he has given to his life. I have heard it said that at the Nuremberg trial, Garria exerted a certain seductive power on his judges because of the vitality which emanated from him. And so, I think we've arrived at evil. I wanted to sort of do up the reasons for existing piece before we got to this, because this is going to change the conversation substantially. What is evil? Right? It's the question of the hour. What is evil? What does it mean to say something is evil for De Beauvoir in this book? I don't think we can quite answer it yet, but I do believe that making oneself hateful by giving one's life meaning that is disgusting is a significant problem that we need to look at in order to not become evil. So, when we think about it, the Nazis definitely did a lot of evil stuff, and they were evil people, but there's a power and a vitality that they could still have, which honestly is a bit of a surprise to me. I would think that there was there would have to be some kind of a negative effect of choosing to be evil or choosing the wrong values, choosing objectively bad values to sort of create your life in the shape of, and I think that's probably still right here. But one of the things that I would have expected to see would be that people who chose to make themselves evil would be detestable, contemptible, lonely people, people like Donald Trump, people who not only would you not want to have a beer with, but like you wouldn't want to ride in the same taxi cab as that guy. You wouldn't want to share an elevator with him. I mean, it would just be loathsome, The man's personality is the type of thing that just grates on the nerves of people. You would want to spend as much time as far away from that dude as possible if you could. And so that's sort of the conception that I picture when I think of evil. I don't think of the seductive devil as being really much of a thing, right? Because the lies don't resemble the world, and the ego sort of starts to take over things, and there's just there's not a lot of charisma that comes from that. It doesn't seem I don't know. And then, Donald Trump was elected president. So obviously a lot of people feel at least somewhat different from the way I feel about the man. So what is this specific character of evil? What is it that makes something evil? And hatefulness is a very specific word to use here. Hateful. Like you start off with hate, and you basically apply it to something else, and what you've just done is you've committed a hateful action. And what that means for us here is that we've essentially we've set someone else up as sort of a target who pain is intended against, and that's what hatefulness is. That's what the problem is here. It's not caring about the subjectivity of someone else. So to the extent that we deny the subjectivity of a different person, perhaps it's safe to say that we're hateful. And to the extent that that is central to the type of person that we choose to become, that makes us evil. I think that's probably okay. Let's continue kind of moving forward. We talked about passion a little bit, but I think this is actually a little bit more important. I'm actually going to take a break just for a couple of minutes here. I will be right back. All right, I am back. I've made some more coffee. Very good. Okay, so let's come here. And yes. Thus, though we have defined him as a denial and a flight, the subman is not a harmless creature. He realizes himself in the world as a blind, uncontrolled force, which anybody can get control of. In lynchings, in pogroms, in all the great bloody movements organized by the fanaticism of seriousness and passion, movements where there is no risk, those who do the actual dirty work are recruited from among the submen. That is why every man who wills himself free within a human world fashioned by free men will be so disgusted by the submen. Ethics is the triumph of freedom over facticity, and the subman feels only the facticity of his existence. Instead of aggrandizing the reign of the human, he opposes his inert resistance to the projects of other men. No project has meaning in the world disclosed by such an existence. Man is defined as a wild flight. The world about him is bare and incoherent. Nothing ever happens. Nothing merits desire or effort. The subman makes his way across a world deprived of meaning toward a death which merely confirms his long negation of himself. The only thing revealed in this experience is the absurd facticity of an existence which remains forever unjustified, if it has not known how to justify itself. The subman experiences the desert of the world in his boredom, and the strange character of a universe with which he has created no bond also arouses fear in him. Weighted down by his present events, he is bewildered before the darkness of the future, which is haunted by frightful specters. War, sickness, revolution, fascism, Bolshevism. The more indistinct these dangers are, the more fearful they become. The subman is not very clear about what he has to lose, since he has nothing, but this very uncertainty reinforces his terror. Indeed, what he fears is that the shock of the unforeseen may remind him of the agonizing consciousness of himself. Wow. I don't know that I can really do much to break that down. I wonder if what we're talking about here is evil or not. I feel that evil is going to turn out to be something that the subman is not capable of. The subman is sort of a force of nature. He's something that's uncontrolled unless you choose to control him. And I think that somebody like Donald Trump does a very good job of controlling the subman. I feel like Adolf Hitler did a great job, and perhaps someone like Stalin did a great job of coming in and telling all these people what to do and sort of animating them. And I feel like what these people all have in common is that the ends that they chose to animate these people for are not good ends. And you think about, maybe a movie, maybe something like City of God, right? The submen, the violent men in that film in particular are people who do not end up doing very well. They tend to fail because they lack vision. They're unable to foresee the consequences of their own violent and immoral actions, and so they're vulnerable to others like themselves. And it's just this kind of meat grinder that damages people and hurts them. And I mean, it's hard to conceive of that as being distinct from evil, but I think at some point these are not moral actions that are taking place because people aren't making moral decisions. So let's kind of put that on the back burner and kind of keep trucking here. I don't have just a ton more time to spend on this today, unfortunately, so we may not get quite all the way through section 2 here. And if we don't, that's fine. It's not a huge deal. I'll do a video with 2A, I guess. That'll be this video. Then we'll do 2B at some point, maybe later tonight or tomorrow. The attitude of the subman passes logically over into that of the serious man. He forces himself to submerge his freedom in the content which the latter accepts from society. He loses himself in the object in order to annihilate his subjectivity. So why are these submen so willing to follow someone else, even though it so frequently ends up badly for them? Well, they don't want to be themselves. The force that animates them is the force that pushes them away from subjectivity. They don't want to acknowledge that they are responsible for their own being, and so they refuse to. And yet, this refusal is a thing of childishness, right? Minority. So basically, these people are choosing to sort of become enslaved. And this is just a thing that happens, mind you. This isn't necessarily anywhere in the moral realm. This is more of the reductive mechanistic account of what actually happens here. And I would say it's still not idealistic, but because what an ideal is at the end of the day is the thing that the serious man feeds to the subman to get him to do what the serious man wants him to do. So you've got kind of this relationship. Okay, and here's a graphic. It says serious here and sub here. So we've got the serious man, and he's exerting a force represented by this vector, I guess you could say. And what that vector is designed to represent is control, which is propagated by the dissemination of ideals. So what we're getting here, it goes far beyond something like Slavoj Žižek's rejection of idealism, or his attempted rejection, right? I don't think he quite gets there. Beauvoir absolutely gets all the way there, and she's, I would say, far more effective, because what she does is she creates this reductive mechanistic account that explains things that have happened by making inferences, right? Such as, hey, look what's going on here. We've got these ideals that are being put out by these serious men to control these inferior men, and yeah, that's what ideology is. That's what ideology does. So that's sort of what's important about ideology and what the function of ideology is. And when you're able to put those things together, I think one of the most important things that comes out of it is sort of this whole page or whole concept type of grasp of what's going on there. So at the same time you're explaining what's happening with ideology, you're also able to sort of put aside the crutch that ideology used to represent to you. We're talking about the subman again. He suppresses himself to the advantage of the thing, which, sanctified by respect, appears in the form of a cause, science, philosophy, revolution, etc. But the truth is that this ruse miscarries, for the cause cannot save the individual insofar as he is a concrete and separate existence. Right? So what you're doing when you choose this cause to be a part of is you are putting yourself aside. You're not making yourself and the cause the same thing. You're actually putting yourself aside. And so that leads to all kinds of unpredictable and bad things happening to you, right? Wait, were we talking about the subman or the serious man here? Oh, so the subman becomes the serious man. He annihilates his subjectivity, and basically that sort of gets rid of the gratuitous, flippant, carefree aspect of what it is to be an adult human. So there's a sort of interplay there. On the one hand, you have risk, and that risk has to be real. On the other hand, you have play, and that play also has to be real. So what happens at the end of the day is that for your adult moral agent, there's both going on. You've got things that need to be taken seriously, and then you've got this space carved out where you can sort of play and create and enjoy, and your life is the thing that comes out of those interplays. These subman or serious man type people, however, are people who never figure out the play side of it and just do the serious side. So she says, the serious is not defined by the nature of the ends pursued. A frivolous lady of fashion can have this mentality of the serious as well as an engineer. There is the serious from the moment that freedom denies itself to the advantage of ends which one claims are absolute. And again, we're back to ideology, right? The absolute end. It's absolutely good. It's absolutely what we want, right? That's the surest way of knowing that you have become an ideologue. Who's the negotiation guy? I can't remember his name. He says he was like a hostage negotiator or something, and he says never be so convinced of what you want that you won't accept something better. And that makes so much sense to me with respect to this ideological sort of mindset that so many people won't seem to want to take up these days. Because you're choosing and you're moving towards that one thing instead of choosing to be yourself and allowing what comes to come and hoping that it's a good thing, right? So you keep your options more open by taking more moral responsibility for your life. Right, okay, so she says, the thing that matters to the serious man is not so much the nature of the object which he prefers to himself, but rather the fact of being able to lose himself in it. So much so that the movement toward the object is, in fact, through his arbitrary act, the most radical assertion of subjectivity. To believe for belief's sake, to will for will's sake, is detaching transcendence from its end, to realize one's freedom in its empty and absurd form of indifference. The serious man's dishonesty issues from his being obliged ceaselessly to renew the denial of this freedom. He chooses to live in an infantile world, but to the child the values are really given. The serious man must mask the movement by which he gives them to himself, like the mythomaniac, who, while reading a love letter, pretends to forget that she has sent it to herself. And that's so profound. I mean, so seriousness is this motion by which the serious man decides that something's important and then conceals that decision from himself so that it appears absolute. This enables him to reduce his subjectivity in the matter. So we do this a lot. If you're ever in a situation where you have to punish someone or if you have to fire someone, you say, well, I'm doing it because those are the rules. And to some extent, that's a defense that's somewhat plausible some of the time. But at the end of the day, to really take complete responsibility for your life, you can't be playing that. You can't be making that subtle move to get rid of your own agency in what happens. You have to own it still. It doesn't matter if you just did it because it was the rule at the company where you were working. That if somebody stole iPhones from the safe, you had to fire that person or whatever it is. It needs to be. It needs to be the case that you're not running from accountability for your actions, and that's the point here. That's the thing that the serious man misses. Oh, and this ebook, guys, I'm sorry, this is translated, and there are some places where the characters aren't exactly right, and then here, unfortunately, it looks like we started our italics, and then they just continued throughout the chapter. It looks like the HTML code to turn off italics, the close, just got omitted here, unfortunately. So it's italicized, but I don't think it's supposed to be. So we're just going to try to kind of roll with this. She says, let's just start here. But the serious man puts nothing into question. For the military man, the army is useful. For the colonial administrator, the highway. For the serious revolutionary, the revolution. Army, highway, revolution, productions becoming inhuman idols to which one will not hesitate to sacrifice man himself. Therefore, the serious man is dangerous. I mean, this sounds like World War II to me. It is natural that he makes himself a tyrant, dishonestly ignoring the subjectivity of choice. He pretends that the unconditioned value of the object is being asserted through him, and by the same token, he also ignores the value of the subjectivity and freedom of others, to such an extent that, sacrificing them to the thing, he persuades himself that what he sacrifices is nothing. So if you're trying to conquer another nation or something, the men that lose their lives in the effort to do that cannot be allowed in the calculus to outweigh the benefit of the conquest itself. There's sort of a I don't know if it's really unspoken or not, but there's sort of a contract that takes place where sometimes some things are supposed to be more important than a human life, or than a dozen or 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 human lives. And so that's interesting. That's something that I believe De Beauvoir is just more or less opposed to here, insofar as she's really opposed to things. I think she's mainly doing some taxonomy for us, and so she's allowing us to sort of see through the power of the lens through which she views the world. So we're getting kind of a glimpse through her eyes of these issues, and it's really powerful stuff. But I'm not sure that she's creating an ideology. In fact, I would even go so far as to assume that she is not creating an ideology here. And she says, Proust observed with astonishment that a great doctor or a great professor often shows himself outside of his specialty to be lacking in sensitivity, intelligence, and humanity. The reason for this is that, having abdicated his freedom, he has nothing else left but his techniques. In domains where his techniques are not applicable, he either adheres to the most ordinary of values or fulfills himself as a flight. The serious man stubbornly engulfs his transcendence in the object which bars the horizon and bolts the sky. The rest of the world is a faceless desert. So this takes me back. This reminds me of why I didn't go to PhD school. I could have probably gotten in. I probably could have gone to a top program. But there was an essay that I had written that was really good, and I didn't use that on the applications that I submitted because I didn't want to pigeonhole myself in just the study of language. I was getting very into neuroscience at the time, and that was an interesting and equally important sort of explanator of human behavior. And so I refused to narrow my focus all the way down. And I believe that what De Beauvoir here is saying is that it's important to do that. I think she might support the decision that I made in my life there. But because this idea that you have to specialize all the way down and you have to be, only well-versed in sort of one thing is just sort of a foolhardy way to approach philosophy, I think. But it's a serious man's approach to philosophy, I believe, is what De Beauvoir would have to say about it. So that's fascinating. Let's see. His very successes will have a taste of ashes, for the serious is one of those ways of trying to realize the impossible synthesis of the in itself and the for itself. The serious man wills himself to be a god, but he is not one and knows it. He wishes to rid himself of his subjectivity, but it constantly risks being unmasked. It is unmasked. Transcending all goals, reflection wonders, what's the use? There then blazes forth the absurdity of a life, which is sought outside of itself, the justifications which it alone could give itself. I mean, that's phenomenal. You can't find life outside of your own meaning. That's absurd. You have to give it to yourself. You have to make it for yourself. She says, nihilism is disappointed seriousness, which is turned back upon itself. A choice of this kind is not encountered among those who, feeling the joy of existence, assume its gratuity. Freedom must be free. It has to be gratuitous. It has to be able to be actualized in any way you feel like it. And the only way to do that is to do it. So be ridiculous. Be more ridiculous, people. That's what she's saying here. This is phenomenal. It appears either at the moment of adolescence, when the individual, seeing his child's universe flow away, feels the lack of which is in his heart, or later on, when the attempts to fulfill himself as a being have failed. In any case, among men who wish to rid themselves of the anxiety of their freedom by denying the world and themselves, by this rejection, they draw near to the subman. The difference is that their withdrawal is not the original movement. As at first they cast themselves into the world, sometimes even with a largeness of spirit. They exist and they know it. And then let's skip just a little bit. But this will to negation is forever belying itself, for it manifests itself as a presence at the very moment that it displays itself. It therefore implies a constant tension, inversely symmetrical with the existential and more painful tension. For if it is true that man is not, it is also true that he exists. And in order to realize his negativity positively, he will have to contradict constantly the movement of existence. If one does not resign himself to suicide, one slips easily into a more stable attitude than this shrill rejection of nihilism. Surrealism provides us with a historical and concrete example of different possible kinds of evolution. Certain initiates, such as Vacher and Crevel, had recourse to the radical solution of suicide. Others destroyed their bodies and ruined their minds by drugs. Others succeeded in a sort of moral suicide by dint of depopulating the world around them. They found themselves in a desert, with themselves reduced to the level of the subman. They no longer try to flee, they are fleeing. There are also some who've again sought out the security of the serious. They have reformed, arbitrarily choosing marriage, politics, or religion as refuges. So again, the real project here is this reductive, mechanistic sort of view that doesn't have all that much content to it. It just says people develop these characteristics. They become serious or they become low, and this leads to certain behavior. And so the inference that we're allowed to make as the readers of this book is to then infer what we can do to prevent ourselves from having the same thing happen to us. So don't take life too seriously, right? I mean, honestly speaking, I would say that's a pretty solid principle here. If we're trying to take a stab at saying, what is the point of this book? I think don't take life too seriously is pretty front and center on that list. Yeah, and choosing marriage, politics, or religion as a refuge is it falls into this reductive mechanistic account. I got marriage and religion. What was the third one? Politics. Yeah. I thought it might be politics, but I wasn't sure. So marriage, politics, and religion are all these sorts of things where there are relationships to other people, and there can be a power dynamic that doesn't necessarily have to be equal. Anyway, and so it's possible to end up being controlled by someone else when you flee into these ideologies that are there. And the ideology of politics would be that the party's right, of religion it would be that the preacher's right, and of marriage would be that the husband or wife was right. And each one sort of becomes an object which the serious man will then put in front of himself, or the serious woman will put in front of herself. And essentially the thing that's being taxonomized here is sort of the hierarchy of those different things and the relationships that form for people who take them on in these particular ways. She says, the taste of nothingness joins the original taste of being, whereby every man is first defined. He realizes himself as a being by making himself that by which nothingness comes into the world. Thus, Nazism was both a will for power and a will for suicide at the same time. And then she says this little gem, the fact is that Nazism was in the service of petite bourgeois seriousness. And I mean, that's powerful, right? I mean, that makes all the sense in the world. Nazism was not really an ideology in itself. Nazism was the vehicle which enabled the production of ideologies, which then, according to our little diagram here, allowed the petite bourgeois serious man in Germany to subvert the German subman, to get him to do a bunch of bad stuff to Jews and neighbors and everybody who was so terribly wronged by that insane moment in German history. Indeed, in human history, honestly. Okay, so here we've got nihilism again. She says, the nihilist attitude manifests a certain truth. In this attitude, one experiences the ambiguity of the human condition. But the mistake is that it defines man not as the positive existence of a lack, but as a lack at the heart of existence. Whereas the truth is that existence is not a lack as such. And if freedom is experienced, in this case, in the form of rejection, it is not genuinely fulfilled. The nihilist is right in thinking that the world possesses no justification and that he himself is nothing, but he forgets that it is up to him to justify the world and to, I believe it says make, and to make himself exist validly. So nihilism and existentialism are two sides of the same coin, but the nihilist sees no need to create himself, whereas the existentialist thinks that in making oneself, we make everything meaningful. We make the world work. We make it worth it. So there's a tightrope here, you know. And on one side, you've got seriousness, and on the other side, you've got childishness. And essentially, the goal of the ethical actor is to walk this tightrope without falling onto either side, if possible. She says, the fundamental fault of the nihilist is that challenging all given values, he does not find beyond their ruin the importance of that universal absolute end which freedom itself is. So the nihilist is an existentialist who doesn't care about freedom or doesn't see the point of freedom, you might say. He will seek a pretext in them for a gratuitous display of activity. Oh, we're talking about the adventurer now. Yes. Such a man is what is generally called an adventurer. He throws himself into his undertakings with zest, into exploration, conquest, war, speculation, love, politics. But he does not attach himself to the end at which he aims, only to his conquest. He likes action for its own sake. He finds joy in spreading through the world of freedom which remains indifferent to its content. Whether the taste for adventure appears to be based on nihilistic despair, or whether it is born directly from the experience of the happy days of childhood, it always implies that freedom is realized as an independence in regard to the serious world, And then on the other hand, the ambiguity of existence is not felt as a lack, but in its positive aspect. So oh, this is funny. I actually met this guy who's just incredible. Like, yeah, I think he would describe himself as an adventurer. His name is Richard Garria. He was the father of the MMORPG. He's been to space. He used to live in Austin. And at my old startup, I got a chance to shake the guy's hand. He's pretty cool. He's been to space. And he is the quintessential adventurer. He likes adventures that are real. He likes imaginary adventures. He likes video game adventures. And I mean, really, storytelling is kind of the important thing for him. He's the manifestation of that "live a great story" meme from that you may or may not know from Austin. And so, when I think about the adventurer, I don't think the Beauvoir is trying to tell us that we all need to be adventurers. I think what she's saying is that there is equally little objective meaning in the life of the nihilist as there is in the life of the adventurer. But the adventurer takes up the task of carving meaning into this world for himself, whereas the nihilist shirks that task and says, oh, it's impossible, or it's too hard, or I can't do it, and doesn't get there. So we got to realize that climbing Mount Everest doesn't mean anything unless it means something to you. So you don't do something like that for someone else. You do it for yourself. So it's absolutely, I would say, an example of the sort of free play that Beauvoir is talking about when she brings up repeatedly this mention of the gratuity of freedom. Let's move just a little bit further down. I think I am going to try to fit this all into one video, because I think we're pretty close to being kind of to section 3 where we're good. So there's the adventurer, there's the nihilist, there's the serious man, there's the subman, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the passionate man. And what characterizes the passionate man, according to Beauvoir, is that he sets up the object as an absolute, not like the serious man as a thing detached from himself, but as a thing disclosed by his subjectivity. There are transitions between the serious and passion. A goal which was not first willed in the name of the serious can become an object of passion. Inversely, a passionate attachment can wither into a serious relationship. But the real passion asserts the subjectivity of its involvement. In amorous passion particularly, one does not want the beloved being to be admired objectively. One prefers to think her unknown, unrecognized. The lover thinks that his appropriation for her is greater if he is alone in revealing her worth. And so there's a sort of jealousy to that, right? It's one of those things where someone else can't give you what I give you because I have this unique appreciation for you, and you should return that. And so there's this. I think love is a great example of sort of what she's talking about here with respect to passion, but because it doesn't necessarily need to be an objective thing. It can be some of the most intense love affairs that you can have are love affairs where you aren't floored by this person at first. You get the opportunity to get to know them, and you find that they appeal to you in ways that you wouldn't have guessed that they would have initially appealed to you, right? And so this passion can kind of grow up and become more serious, right? And she talks about the serious relationship being what the passionate attachment withers into, and that's the stage of the relationship where things become a chore, and maybe neither partner is getting out what they initially were. When the flame burned a little brighter, right? And here she says, that is the genuine thing offered by all passion. The moment of subjectivity therein vividly asserts itself in its positive form in a movement toward the object. And so the seriousness comes from this tendency that we have to try to put objects above ourselves, to see them as being valuable despite us, instead of seeing them as being valuable because we think they're valuable. So there's this recognition of one's own agency in choosing what to love, that sort of is primary, I would say, here for De Beauvoir. And we kind of go through a little bit of passion here, but I believe that the passionate stuff is a little bit less relevant to sort of where we are in the world today, because at the heart of the problems that face the earth right now, I would say seriousness is probably far and away number one, and passion is a bit less prevalent. Yeah, so let's just kind of move through a little bit here. This is great too. She says, the artist and the writer force themselves to surmount existence in another way. They attempt to realize it as an absolute. What makes their effort genuine is that they do not propose to attain being. They distinguish themselves from an engineer or a maniac. It is existence which they are trying to pin down and make eternal. The word, the stroke, the very marble indicate the object insofar as it is an absence. Only in the work of art, the lack of being returns to the positive. Time is stopped. Clear forms and finished meanings rise up. In this return, existence is confirmed and establishes its own justification. This is what Kant said when he defined art as a finality without end. So what art does, I guess, here is it divorces the temporal nature of a moment from the content of that moment. And isn't that so cool? Because, I mean, this is a book that's 72 years old that we're reading back through, and it's almost as if De Beauvoir has kind of called her shot here. You know, she said, look, I pulled off this chunk of reality, and I made this simulation of it, and it'll last. You know, it'll last far beyond the moment in which it was actually created. Now we're back to talking about hate a bit. Hate. Oh man. Okay. Yeah, but this hatred is naive, and the desire immediately struggles against itself. If I were really everything, there would be nothing beside me. The world would be empty. There would be nothing to possess, and I myself would be nothing. If he is reasonable, the young man immediately understands that by taking the world away from me, others also give it to me, since a thing is given to me only by the movement which snatches it from me. To will that there be being is also to will that there be men, and for whom the world is endowed with human significations. One can reveal the world only on a basis revealed by other men. No project can be defined except by its interference with other projects. To make being be is to communicate with others by means of being. She's saying that the most important part of art or of writing a book is the conversation which comes from that. And I absolutely agree. This truth is found in another form when we say that freedom cannot will itself without aiming at an open future. The ends which it gives itself must be unable to be transcended by any reflection, but only the freedom of other men can extend them beyond our life. I have tried to show in Pyrrhus and Cineas that every man needs the freedom of other men, and in a sense always wants it, even though he may be a tyrant. The only thing he fails to do is assume honestly the consequences of such a wish. Only the freedom of others keeps each one of us from hardening in the absurdity of facticity. And if we are to believe the Christian myth of creation, God himself was in agreement on this point with the existentialist doctrine, since, in the words of an anti-fascist priest, he had such respect for man that he created him free. I think that's a great spot to end in our little reading of section 2 here on. And you know, honestly, I do not believe that we have completely solved, as it were, the issue of what is evil. I don't think we quite got there this time. I think maybe in section 3 that's possible. But I will say that it dawns on me that it's possible that for De Beauvoir, what evil is anything that sort of stunts the development of man and prevents us from being able to become ourselves. So impingements upon liberty would be certainly things that were evil in that reading, which I don't necessarily want to marry yet. I think let's finish doing our deep exegesis of the text here and kind of come to that conclusion, once we hopefully have a little bit more evidence for what we're going to think about it. But yeah, I mean, when we're thinking about ethics and we're thinking about ethical thought, we generally expect there to be sort of this codex that sort of attempts to illuminate the world for us and make it clear that we should act in one way or another. And that most certainly is just not what Beauvoir has, in mind here. She does want to look at the world and come up with this sort of reductive mechanistic account of behavior, but at the same time she's not interested in going overly into detail with respect to that behavior. And so when I decided to kind of skip through some of the discussion of the passionate man in section 2, the reason that I did that has to do with sort of what the point of the book is, and the fact that I feel that the discussion of passion is sort of there because of the the impulse that wasn't entirely gotten rid of by her to try to be as thorough as possible, which that's fine. There's nothing wrong with thoroughness, but at the same time, the impression that I believe this book is designed to create for us, and the experience that we are supposed to sort of have when we read it, is not the sort of thing where somebody's going to jump out and give you a pop quiz, and the pop quiz will have a bunch of questions on it, and you'll remember the text and be able to recall the answer and pick A, B, C, or D or whatever. I mean, it's not that type of a thing. The point of this book isn't to explain sort of what all these things are so that you can tell someone else. The point of this book is that you read it, and by reading it, you are able to sort of put things together in a way that you hadn't in the past. So this book is a piece of software that installs itself on your brain when you read it, right? And you become able to sort of think in these ways that Beauvoir thinks. And insofar as it's like that, it's a standalone book and not sort of the birthplace of a new study of moral philosophy. So perhaps if we're looking for a reason to assume that's at work in making this book less popular than it should be by rights, with regard to sort of the contribution that it's able to produce for the modern ethical discipline, then perhaps that's a good place to start. But because I think what academics tend to look for in books is something like that principle that just gets distilled out. And this book is, it has some, but those aren't the main feature. The main feature is what it does to you as you read it. And that's why I think it's such a perfect place to start with this underground philosophy, Twitch-based school that we've kind of got going here. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable place to kind of give up the ghost here. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I don't think there are any viewers today, but maybe there will be tomorrow. I don't know. Maybe I should have done this at like 8 or 9 so that people could follow along or something. But otherwise, I feel like everything went really well, and I mean, this is great and this is fun. So hopefully some people will get some value out of it, and if they do, I'll be happy. Mission accomplished. Cheers, and don't stop reading, everybody. We'll see you later.